How does Hunter then cope with this? Hunter has actually started developing a whole set of blocking strategies, and he deals with structural strategies to try to achieve this. So he has gone and spent hours trying to get Facebook to have different organizational pieces so that he can separate out the different communities. And the example that he gave me, which was sort of delightful, is this moment where he really likes Pokemon and Legends of Zelda. But these games are not particularly cool or high status within his home community group, even though they're cool and high status at school, because they're sort of seen as retro at school. And the challenge is whenever he or his friends talk about Pokemon or Legends of Zelda, his cousins come in and mock him and mock all of his friends. And so he wants to deal with a way of sort of separating out these two worlds so that his cousins who are much more into shoot-'em games aren't making fun of him just because he doesn't want to deal with it. So he has gone through and built all of these sort of infrastructure about which games he can talk to of which groups. Right? This is a lot of work. This takes a lot of effort to figure it out with each kind of content. It's not that this content is offensive per se. It's that he wants this boundary work to actually solve a social problem. And it's the social issue that he struggles with. Now, the more we see young people with sort of intense social structures that they're dealing with, the more innovative their sort of strategies become. And I met a young woman named Shamika, so she's sort of dealing with this challenge where what she's found in her school is that people turn past posts on Facebook into highly dramatic events. And anything that you have in your past is possible fodder for future and current drama. So the way that she approaches Facebook is through a strategy that she describes as whitewalling, which is problematic as a term, but we'll roll with it. And the idea is that every day she logs into Facebook and she deletes any comment she gets after she reads it. And the day after she writes a comment on anybody else's page, she goes through and then deletes that the next day, assuming that it'll take about a day for them to read it. And she goes through and basically constantly cleans out and culls all of her data. Again, a lot of work. And I said to her, well, what happens if somebody copied and pasted that content and stored it for later? Or what happens, when the company has a copy of all of this? And she goes, that's not the point. I don't care if people have gotten copies. If they've gotten copies, that means they put a lot of work into it. And that just makes you look creepy. Right? So for her, it was the idea of making it very clear that this took effort, and anybody who took the effort to do that was actually violating a social norm again. A friend of hers, Michaela, had a different strategy to it, another sort of abuse of Facebook in a really delightful way, something that we talk about as the super log off. Michaela is dealing with a situation where she's basically is constantly dealing with state services for various reasons, and she doesn't want the state to be looking in at all of her content. So what she does is she logs into Facebook every day and reactivates her account. And at the end of the day, when she is done using it, she deactivates her account. For those who haven't spent much time on Facebook, Facebook has made it very difficult for you to delete your account, so they have a process by which you can deactivate your account, and if you change your mind later, you can reactivate it. So what she does is every day she logs in and she deactivates or activates her account and deactivates it. When she is deactivated, nobody can see any of her content. They can't see her friends, even if they're friends with her. They can't send her messages, etc. And she turns Facebook into a real-time activity. Right? It's her way of knowing that when she's logged in, other people are logged in. So I was asking her about all of the reasons why she did this and whatnot, and she said, it's not like any adults actually look at Facebook at night. They only look at it when I'm at school in the day. So from her perspective, if she's deactivated all day, they don't think she exists. For her, the ability to sort of go on at night, reactivate when all of her friends are there, and if she didn't get on at night, then her friends start texting her. Because they know if she's not reactivated, that means there's something going on, something wrong. And it's her way of actually using a structural strategy to try to achieve some semblance of privacy, even when it completely violates how Facebook was architected to code. Third core key approaches to all of this is different kinds of social strategies that young people use. And these are some of the most common strategies that young people use to try to achieve privacy. And the first of which I will tell you about is Carmen. And Carmen, who we mentioned earlier, sort of complaining about her mother sort of commenting and basically silencing everything, Carmen had a situation where she had just broken up with her boyfriend and she was feeling really sad. And she really wanted to tell all of her friends that she was feeling really sad. But she knew that if she posted some sappy love poem or something sort of deeply emotional, her mother would read this as thinking she was suicidal. because she didn't want her mother to overreact, and she knew that her mother always overreacted. So she sort of thought about how to actually signal to her friends what was actually going on without signaling to her mother what was going on. And her friends, being sort of a geeky type, she decided to post song lyrics from Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Now, for those who are not geeks in the room, you will know that this song is sung in The Life of Brian, a Monty Python film, when the main character is about to be executed, right? And it's a very happy song, like always look at, I'm not singing, but it's like always look on the bright side of life is one of the key lyrics to it. Her mother, commenting as usual, immediately posted, it looks like you're doing really well. And her friends immediately texted her and goes, what's actually going on? Right? This is actually a way of thinking about social steganography. This is a way of hiding in plain sight. So what you see is that young people are actually using content very much to put things out there where people don't even know that it's content that they should be looking for. They just see song lyrics without realizing all of the meaning for it. And what you see is this is a strategy where young people are not trying to control access, they're trying to control meaning, right? So they're not limiting the ability to get access to the content, they're limiting the ability to get access to the meaning. You have to be in the know. Now this is a case where the idea of even being in the know requires a lot of work. You need to know that she just broke up with her boyfriend. You need to know that she's posting about it, and that was what the song lyric refers to. You need to have the cultural context to understand Monty Python. There's a lot of layers of knowing. But there's also a set of strategies from young people where they use things to signal that you don't even know that you know that you don't understand it, but you don't know why. So this was two posts that I saw when I was sitting down with a woman in North Carolina and said, what is this about? And I saw this post that said, I'm sick and tired of all this, and it was liked by 32 people. And then another post not very far long and said, she's such a bitch, liked by 50 people. And of course, Christy immediately bursts in and tells me all sorts of details about all of the dramas between these two girls and how they're fighting, and inevitably involves a boy, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I realized that all of her friends, all of the people in the school know exactly what's going on by these two messages. The use of pronouns, everybody knows how to decode the pronouns. They know what this is referring to. Teachers, on the other hand, who I also asked in the school, had seen this, had no idea what it meant, and knew they couldn't ask, right? And that becomes an important barrier. It's the ability to know whether or not you're allowed to ask. If you're part of the social peer group, you're allowed to ask. If you're a mother, you're not. Right? Again, we see this moment where we're controlling access to meaning, not controlling access to content. All of these are sort of privacy strategies that become really important because one of the ways that you can actually understand what young people are doing is that they're living out a participation in a network public life where they're actually engaging in a lot of work that we understand as the flaneur. So if you think historically, in Parisian society, Baudelaire was obsessed with the notion of a flaneur, the person who walked and strolled the streets of Paris to see and be seen. And what you see is that young people are doing the same thing. They want to see and they want to be seen. But that doesn't mean that they want to expose everything. And they're really very much thinking about ways of actually controlling that. They're not necessarily, just like the flaneur, they're not purely exhibitionists. They're not purely voyeurs. They're somewhere in between in terms of a participation level. And their participation there becomes really critical because what you see is that young people come to understand a social world through their interactions with their peers. And the more and more that we actually restrict young people from access to public spaces, the more that they try to find a public space that is their own, and they try to make it their own and create new structures for privacy. Now, of course, one of the challenges is that they're doing this in a way where they're much more visible to more people than even they imagine. But they're not necessarily aware of all of the digital privacy issues or the data privacy issues that many of you are talking about. They're not aware of the role of corporations or governments in looking in on them. Because one of the things is their day-to-day life, they're constantly dealing with a very real level of surveillance. And that is surveillance by the people who hold power over them. That is their parents, that is their teachers. People who generally mean well, but whose constant state of gaze is actually really oppressive to them. And one of the things that they're trying to do is make sense of it there. So the strategies that they're developing may not apply to the data privacy questions that we all care about, but are certainly their way of showing that they do care about privacy, that they are trying to make it work for themselves, and they're doing it by any means possible. Thank you very much. Time for about 5 minutes of questions, I think. If anybody has them. Why don't you just let them go on? Do you have a question?
Do you have numbers on what percentage of teens are engaging in this kind of behavior? Is this anomalous or is this the majority behavior? And just on the boundary stuff, is this related to the consent or contronious? Is that?
Sure. So I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but a huge number of young people are engaged in different kinds of strategies to achieve privacy. These sort of more qualitative descriptions, I don't know, but the privacy settings modifications are huge. And actually, one of the things we've seen over the time with Facebook is that the further along we've gone and the further away it's gone from being just college and just high school, the more young people are trying to do things. Now, the thing is that when we interview them, what they're trying to do and what it actually achieves don't match up. So their strategies don't necessarily result in the outcomes that they believe in. But I'm hard-pressed to find a young person who isn't thinking about privacy in some way. They're just dealing with different things. One of the things that you may have noticed, though, is that a lot of these kids that I'm talking about are kids of color. And one of the things that becomes really clear in my fieldwork is that the less privileged kids are much more conscious about trying to find innovative strategies and trust the technology much less than the more privileged kids that I deal with. The more privileged kids are much more likely to hope that the technology will solve their problems. The young kids, the less privileged kids, are not actually thinking that at all.
Hi, my name is Anthony. I work for Shazzle. So you mentioned that people kind of have the ability to form an idea of, a local authority figure, school principal, local officer, or whatever, but not really the corporation or government. I mean, how does that kind of play into the longer scheme of life, right? Like something you say when you're 16 on Facebook could be used, when you're 40 in a lawsuit or something.
Right.
I mean, what is that concept with them?
So let's be honest, that concept doesn't work for anybody. I mean, Anthony Weiner is a sort of great case of that. So I think that we have this mistake that we can all project into the future and imagine how our data is going to be used, and young people are no better at than adults. Again, I run into a very interesting state of privilege when I start to tease that out. So kids that are from environments where they're expected to be going to Harvard and will one day be president are doing the kinds of work that you hear in this city all the time, trying to imagine and thinking about doing these heavy self-presentations. And I certainly ran into that, although primarily it was with kids who thought of themselves sort of as the future governor leader types, but also the future sports stars. And the future sports stars were some of the more interesting to me because they were aware of the constant gaze of coaches and the ways in which their reputation as they went forward really mattered. And that doesn't mean that they weren't doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. They were doing a lot of performative work to make it look like they weren't. But for the most part, people don't think about long extended futures, right? And it doesn't really get better when you get to be adults. But the thing that you realize is that when you sort of tease it all out, what ends up happening is that the more you have to lose, the more you're conscious of these issues. But when you're actually thinking about the more you have to gain, you think about all the possibilities of what the reasons for putting things out publicly. And for a lot of young people, what you see is that for the most part, they have more to gain than they have to lose in their own mindset. The older you get, the equation tends to reverse, although it tends to reverse in really funny ways that get inflected by race, class, and gender. How does Hunter then cope with this? Hunter has actually started developing a whole set of blocking strategies, and he deals with structural strategies to try to achieve this. So he has gone and spent hours trying to get Facebook to have different organizational pieces so that he can separate out the different communities. And the example that he gave me, which was sort of delightful, is this moment where he really, really likes Pokemon and Legends of Zelda. But these games are not particularly cool or high status within his home community group, even though they're cool and high status at school, because they're sort of seen as retro at school. And the challenge is whenever he or his friends talk about Pokemon or Legends of Zelda, his cousins come in and mock him and mock all of his friends. And so he wants to deal with a way of sort of separating out these two worlds so that his cousins who are much more into shoot-'em games aren't making fun of him just because he doesn't want to deal with it. So he has gone through and built all of these sort of infrastructure about which games he can talk to of which groups. Right? This is a loss on Facebook into highly dramatic events. And anything that you have in your past is possible fodder for future and current drama. So the way that she approaches Facebook is through a strategy that she describes as whitewalling, which is problematic as a term, but we'll roll with it. And the idea is that every day she logs into Facebook, and she deletes any comment she gets after she reads it. And the day after she writes a comment on anybody else's page, she goes through and then deletes that the next day, assuming that it'll take about a day for them to read it. And she goes through and basically constantly cleans out and culls all of her data. Again, a lot of work. And I said to her, well, what happens if somebody copied and pasted that content and stored it for later? Or what happens, when the company has a copy of all of this? And she goes, that's not the point. I don't care if people have gotten copies. If they've gotten copies, that means they put a lot of work into it. And that just makes you look creepy, right? So for her, it was the idea of making it very work. This takes a lot of effort to figure it out in each kinds of content. It's not that this content is offensive per se. It's that he wants this boundary work to actually solve a social problem. And it's the social issue that he struggles with. Now, the more we see young people with sort of intense social structures that they're dealing with, the more innovative their strategies become. And I met a young woman named Shamika, so she's sort of dealing with this challenge where what she's found in her school is that people turn past posts